so excited to be joined today for a special breakthrough live stream with British Iraqi hip hop artist and campaigner Lowkey. Lowkey, welcome to Breakthrough News.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
So I guess let's just jump into it. We just had this crazy 2-week almost offensive by the Israelis against Gaza. You're coming to us from the where there was massive rallies. There was a rally about 150,000 people a couple weeks ago. And then recently, even after the Gaza fire, we saw 200,000 people come out to show their solidarity with Palestine. So I guess let's start off with, can you paint us a scene of the activism situation in London, and how has it changed around Palestine? Is this massive of a rally over this issue a new phenomenon?
Well, essentially, the Palestinians have been articulating their unfreedom for a long time. How those yearnings for justice have been interpreted in the home of the Balfour Declaration, and very much the place where the implementation of the Balfour Declaration through the British Mandate gave the foundational basis for the apartheid state through different educational institutions and other things. You are talking about a bond that has existed between people here as trade union groupings, as solidarity groups with the Palestinians, as at this stage being back, I would say, to the kind of level it seemed to be in 2009 and 2010. The years following on from that were, of course, worn away at by the war in Syria, but then also the prevent agenda, demobilizing people within society, pushing them away from talking about Palestine. You, of course, have examples of children under the prevent duty, which is counter-extremism duty in schools, which when young people were talking about Palestine, they ran the risk of being questioned by police without the presence of their parents, for example. So you had this kind of institutionalized way of demobilizing young people. However, now, of course, we have seen the Palestinians rising up in a unified way, which we have not seen in my lifetime. Certainly, you have this clear, concerted effort by those within the Green Line, by those in Shitat, by those inside the West Bank, and those in Gaza, of course, linking arms and linking together and finding ways for them to be ungovernable, for them to be not able to be controlled really in the same way. How we connect to that, though, is the essential question. You have major trade unions in this country that, as of 2010, passed motions which were voted for by their members to partake in BDS. However, what has happened since that point is you have had a decade in which those unions have not applied BDS. And some of those unions, for example, have members who make the components for the F-16, which would have been used in Gaza, the HUD display unit in the F-16 fighter jet is made in this country by BAE Systems. You've got the F-35 also having components made by BAE Systems. Workers within unions that have passed BDS are still making these components for the Israeli war machine. You have 10 different sites for Elbit Systems, the Israeli arms company here. You have over 100 different companies that have offices and factories here that sell military equipment to Israel. So, of course, the campaign really needs to be stepped up in terms of challenging the material ways in which Britain relates to settler colonial apartheid. We've seen a massive increase in direct action taking place with an organization like Palestine Action, who have occupied and shut down numerous Elbit Systems or subsidiaries of Elbit Systems, shutting down their factories again and again and again. And the great thing this time is that when they shut down a factory in Leicester, not only did the fire brigade, when they were called, refuse to remove them from the roof, following the solidarity that was put out by the FBU, the Fire Brigades Union, but on top of that, the local community in Leicester came out to support those people on the roof and block the police from entering and removing them. And for 6 days, they shut down a piece of the Israeli war machine in Leicester. Today, that very same organization has shut down an Elbit Systems factory in Birmingham. And as far as I understand, much of the community in Birmingham have also joined them to support them. So really, we are at an unprecedented time in terms of Britain's relationship, people to people, with Palestine, not in a form of vertical solidarity, but a form of horizontal solidarity with the Palestinians. And so we have to intensify that, and we have to increase that as much as we can. And in a way, be willing to take instructions from Palestinian civil society.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned Elbit Systems, and I just want to note this is one of Israel's largest weapons companies. And oftentimes, you know, we've talked about on this show before, but Israel uses Palestine as this sort of weapons laboratory to test and perfect these sort of mechanisms of domination and control that it then sells around the world as being battle tested and combat proven. And Elbit Systems is one of these companies. It's one of the leaders in drone technology, which is essentially tested on Gaza. And also, you know, at the US-Mexico border, there's a lot of Elbit Systems technology, particularly related to border surveillance, that they have huge contracts that they build these surveillance towers at the US border that's then used to capture people trying to make their way across the US border from countries that are devastated mostly by US imperialism. But anyways, it's just making it a little bit more global here. It's incredible what's happening with these sort of shutdowns that you mentioned in the UK of these Elbit Systems factories. And I believe, like you mentioned, there's one that's been taking place for about 6 days, was shut down. It's pretty incredible. We don't see that sort of stuff happening in the US. And I thought that kind of leads into the next question I wanted to ask you is, you know, I mentioned these massive protests in the UK, and you gave some background to that. But, you know, when I look at the global north, I think the UK is probably the place where I saw the biggest protests. Speaking just for like the global north, why do you think that is? You were talking about some of these trade union solidarity campaigns, but why is it that in the UK you see far larger protests than you might in the US or Europe?
Well, I think, you know, the Palestinian people are trapped in a state of what people term hauntology. It's a pining for a future which never arrived, following on from the twin crimes of politicide and memorycide against them. People in Britain have a keen awareness that Britain, as a power that occupied 14 million miles of the globe, has a historical responsibility towards what is happening there. But more than that, when you think about the population of Britain, you're looking at about 300 to 400,000 Arabs here, obviously in relation to the United States, which has a population of 330 million people. 300, 400,000 people is not that much, but in relation to Britain, where the population is around 65, 67 million people, 300,000 people largely concentrated in London, or the Arab community, but also there's over 1 million people from Southeast Asia, Pakistan, here as well. So there is a great feeling among diasporic populations that they see not only in a decolonial struggle that has gone on in Palestine and continues to this day, they see a reflection of themselves in many ways. And the symbolism that Palestine has come to represent around the world of this very clear dichotomy between the indigenous and European settlers who seek to subjugate them, and as a long enduring injustice, which many people feel a deep sense of grievance and righteous indignation towards, the Palestinian cause is quite exceptional in what it represents. Because when we think about all of the UN resolutions, all of the laws that Israel violates seemingly with impunity, never having sanctions put against it. We saw Palestinians trying to practice their right under Article 11 of the UN Resolution 194. 70% of Gaza are refugees seeking to march home. And we knew that when hundreds of them were sniped down and thousands of them were injured, many of their legs being amputated, that the components within those snipers were very likely to have been British. You know, the British sold sniper components to the Israelis prior to the Great March of Return and during the Great March of Return. So many people in Britain feel a special sense of, on one hand, responsibility, but on the other hand, a real form of solidarity that is based in their own experiences as post-colonial subjects or diasporic communities.
You know, it's interesting the way you brought it up, because on the one hand, you see Palestine has really become in so many ways this symbol of a fight against oppression. And then you have, on the other hand, Israel and its flag becoming increasingly a symbol of the far right and of almost like a fascistic ethno-chauvinism. And so can you talk a little bit about that in the British context? Because there is, you recently made this video for Double Down News, which was really great, and I encourage everybody to go check it out. And in it, you talk a little bit about this relationship between the far right in the UK and the far right and the Israeli state. And we have a similar dynamic in the US, where a lot of far right Islamophobic politicians, a lot of far right protests, you'll see them waving Israeli flags. How does that play out in UK politics?
Well, I think one thing that people seldom remember is that the Zionist political figure who has the most streets and parks named after him in Israel is Vladimir Jabotinsky. He was originally trained in the British Army in World War I, but following on from that, he was a great admirer of Mussolini. This is a fact. He was closely aligned with Ukrainian fascists. And also, we have to remember that Israel has been the greatest friend of right-wing fascists from Latin America to Ukraine to the United States. Israel has always had a kinship with those kind of figures. But when we're talking about what's happening in the UK, really the two most commonly identified pushers of a pogrom-like Islamophobia within this country across at least the last decade, if not more, are Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson. Now, Katie Hopkins was trained at Sandhurst. Her university education at Exeter was paid for by, as according to her in an interview with The Guardian, the military intelligence, whom she signed a contract with, British military intelligence, following leaving university. The only reason today that she is not in the British Army, according to Katie Hopkins, is that she has epilepsy, because while she was at Sandhurst, they identified this epilepsy and she could not complete her journey into the British military. Now, who are Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson? Well, where have they got funding from? Both of them have been employed in the last decade by the David Horowitz Freedom Center. And when we think about where the funding for the David Horowitz Freedom Center has come from, one of the sources has been the Hertog Foundation. The Hertog Foundation also funds Friends of David, which is ELAD, the settler group intent on ethnically cleansing a Sheikh Jarrah. Hertog Foundation not only funded the employers of Katie Hopkins and Tommy Robinson, they also funded the Henry Jackson Society. Now, of course, Henry Jackson, the senator in the US, was known as Senator Boeing, and the Henry Jackson Society continues in that vein, constantly promoting war, constantly promoting securitization, constantly promoting a greater allocation of funds towards the figures of the military industrial complex. Henry Jackson Society are largely believed through their student rights campaign to have been the main purveyors of the prevent duty, which was practiced following the student rights campaign in Britain. The Hertog Foundation also funded the Centre for Security Policy, who were not only providing the basic foundation for Trump and his Muslim ban, they were also quoted in the White House's press release announcing the Muslim ban. The Hertog Foundation also funds the Council on Foreign Relations and the Friends of the IDF and Middle East Forum, who in turn funded Tommy Robinson. You also look at other groups like the Claremont Family Foundation, who also funded the Center for Security Policy and funded the Middle East Forum, which funded Tommy Robinson, but also on top of that, as a think tank, was quoted 13 times by Anders Breivik in his manifesto. Another organization that funds ELAD, this settler group, is the Jacobson Family Foundation. They also fund Birthright, the Washington Institute, and the Friends of the IDF, and Israel on Campus Coalition. We can't forget that the Friends of the IDF had a director by the name of Rob Shillman. Rob Shillman funded Tommy Robinson through the David Horowitz Center as one of his Shillman Fellows. It has been found by Sarah Marusek in her chapter in the amazing book by David Miller, Tom Mills, and others, What is Islamophobia? She found that 75% of the organizations who fund the Global Islamophobia Network also fund the building of illegal Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which, as we all know, have been clearly been, you look at paragraph 6, Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, it outlaws the occupying power from transferring parts of its own civilian population into the territory it rules. You've got 440 Israeli colonies in the West Bank, over 500,000 settlers who are armed and who do take part in internal Israeli elections. Even Avigdor Lieberman, who was the foreign minister of Israel, and I think at one point deputy PM, he was the only foreign minister that I know of in history that has lived outside of his nation's borders, supposedly. You not only have those 440 colonies home to 500,000 settlers, you have 565 checkpoints and 300 flying checkpoints. And those settlements consume 80% of all of the available water in the West Bank. And on top of that, 133 military bases have been constructed since 67. So what we're talking about is really a minority controlling a majority of the population. We're talking about UN Resolution 2334 being clear that the settlements are illegal. And even when you look at somebody like the billionaire at Chelsea, Roman Abramovich, moving £100 million from the British Virgin Islands. And it's important that we take into account that Britain has a network of tax havens, which are responsible for 37% of all tax losses that governments face in the world. And when we look at the directions that money comes from for these illegal settlements, they often come from either charities who are tax exempt in the United States and in Britain, but they also seem to come from tax havens, from Britain's tax havens around the world. This is another way in which Britain is implicated in the Palestinian tragedy.
It's pretty incredible. And I mean, the situation you just described in the West Bank, it's like the word apartheid, I don't even think is strong enough to actually describe what's happening there. Real quick, I just want to give a shout out to Bobby Rasuli, who gave money in the super chat. For those who are watching, we're speaking to British Iraqi hip hop artist and campaigner Lowkey. And if you want to get a shout out, you can always throw money in the super chat. And of course, I have to mention, you can support Breakthrough News at patreon.com/breakthrough news. It allows us to do these live streams, to do reporting, and to provide you all the kind of content you like to see. But no, back to what you were talking about, and really laying out the relationship between the British far right and Israel. I think what's important to note, and we have this dynamic in the U.S. too. I mean, the entire you actually mentioned some Americans in what you were describing in terms of the support for Israeli settlements and for the Islamophobia industry. But when it comes to this issue, what you have liberal Israel supporters doing in the US, and we saw it play out as well in the UK, is trying to disrupt this solidarity with Palestine and this kind of exposing of Israel's settler colonialism and violence by invoking the issue of anti-Semitism, right? And trying to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And this worked quite well against Jeremy Corbyn, and really tarnishing his reputation and making it very difficult for him to win. And he was essentially eliminated from politics as a result, from the Labor Party. And right now in the US, we've seen after this onslaught in Gaza, when I think there's been this, I would say it's pretty unprecedented, the number of public officials and just politicians, celebrities, people in the public eye speaking out against what Israel's doing has been quite unprecedented this time around. And as a result, you immediately saw this attempt to try and equate Palestine solidarity with anti-Semitism. So can you talk about the experience of activists in the UK having to deal with this? Not just, I mean, you can talk a little bit about the Jeremy Corbyn issue, but beyond that, this issue of equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism and why that's just completely wrong.
Well, I mean, firstly, if we look at the amount of Jewish people there are in the world, we're looking at almost 15 million. Okay, if we look at how many of those Jewish people are citizens of the state of Israel, it's about 6.7 million. So on one hand, we can deduce from that a majority of the world's Jewish community are not Zionists, potentially. Even if we take it further and we say that actually Arabs are Semites too, then what you have is a tiny minority movement among people that perceive themselves as Semites, that define themselves as Semites, that somehow is able to define what is and what isn't anti-Semitism. On the other side of that, we also have to be clear that when you say that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, not only are you unpeopling 12.5 million Palestinians, you're also invisibilizing what is a tradition of Jewish anti-Zionism, which is represented even by the very person who is credited with coining the phrase Zionism, Nathan Birnbaum. Aside from all of that, though, what we're talking about is a clear weaponization of something in order to shut down debate. Now, there's a difference between racialization or racialism, shall we say, and racism. There's a difference between interpersonal discrimination and structural racism and the way that those things affect people. If one was to say that Jewish people today in Britain suffer from interpersonal discrimination, then I would agree. If one was to say that under Schedule 7 Terrorism Act, you're 154 times more likely to be stopped if you are deemed to be a man of Pakistani origin, you are over 7 times more likely to be stopped by the police if you are a black man, you are more likely, far more likely to be referred for prevent if you are deemed to be a Muslim child. There are clear ways in which structural discrimination affects people racialized a certain way today. Can you make the same argument for a group of people that even if you look at the Israeli army, they have 7,000 what you call lone soldiers. These are people that do not have Israeli citizenship and enter the Israeli occupying forces for 14 to 18 months. Following those months, they are then able to go back to the society that they come from. Now, Israel, we have seen, is committing collective punishment through the siege on Gaza, which is a crime under the Geneva Conventions. We are looking at the targeting of civilians, which of course is a crime under international law. We are looking at a myriad of ways in which the Israeli military breaks the law. If there were institutional racism within this society, people that were coming back from service within the IDF would be far more likely to be under very, very close, not only surveillance, but potentially put in prison. But we don't have that kind of society today. When we're talking about groups that are funding the far right in this country, we can't also forget that Trevor Chin, for example, of BICOM, the Israeli lobby organization, and the Conservative Friends of Israel fund 1/3 of conservative MPs, including the Prime Minister Boris Johnson. But Trevor Chin from BICOM also funded Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party. We are in a situation where Unit 8200, and this, by the way, is not an accident. Paul Singer, who is a top Republican donor, set up with the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs and Dan Senor an organization called Startup Nation. And their stated purpose is to combat BDS by pushing former Unit 8200, which is a unit in the IDF which specializes in social listening, which has been found to historically have blackmailed Palestinians based on their communications, their electronic communications. Now, this organization that Paul Singer set up with the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, its stated purpose is to combat BDS by feeding Unit 8200, former Unit 8200 employees into big tech companies. Whitney Webb found in her investigation that you have at least 28 former Unit 8200 people within Google. You have around 13, at least, former Unit 8200 people within Facebook. But you know where else you have a former employee of Unit 8200? The Labour Party. And what we've seen is people that dare to speak out about these type of incestuous relationships between Israel, those that work for Israel's interest in the rest of the world, and the Labour Party, and the British political system. You've even had people that I know someone whose father was killed by a neo-Nazi terrorist who later went on to plant bombs outside 3 mosques in the Midlands. She was suspended from the Labour Party for retweeting something that I tweeted, which was quoting a UN resolution calling Zionism racism. So what we're talking about is extreme levels of censorship. And let's not forget that Israel, between 2005 and 2018, according to the Palestinian Prisoners Center, arrested 500 people for the crime of posting on social media posts that Israel didn't like. Some of them were children. So while simultaneously in Britain, we are having children being reprimanded at school for saying Free Palestine, for holding the Palestinian flag, and being called racist by teachers. This is happening right now in British schools. Simultaneous to that, Israel is able to arrest children for posting on social media. All of that is interrelated. You do not have the censorship in the political class existing in a vacuum. It also plays out in other places across society. It's not always clear censorship. Sometimes it's censorship by omission. Sometimes it's, as you will know better than me, algorithmic engineering, which places things slightly outside the earshot or the eyeshot of the masses. But that is what we are dealing with today. When you're talking about 250 Jewish Google employees coming out and saying that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism and must be protected by this company, then you know that this is a real problem. And we have to look more critically at the investigation by Whitney Webb that reveals that you've got 28 former Unit 8200 people within Google. Are these two things unrelated? That's my question.
No, and you also have this partnership between Israel lobbying organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, which tries to portray itself as this anti-racist organization, but is of course quite the opposite. That is actually advising Facebook and Twitter and all these other social media giants on what constitutes hate speech. And I believe now they're advising the NBA. And it's all really disturbing because they are essentially leading this charge of anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism and therefore is hate speech and should be removed from the internet. And not to take away the seriousness of what we're discussing, but I did want to bring up this tweet because I think it speaks to another issue I want to talk about. There was this viral tweet yesterday by this writer. I believe she writes for Tablet. And this is the kind of, it's almost like a parody. I didn't think this was real. She's saying, my Jewish friend saw a sign that said free parking and panicked that it said free Palestine. The Jews are tired. And so this attitude, I want to talk about this attitude for a moment, because what I see is these people, first of all, this, of course, this is what you were talking about, right? One person speaking on behalf of all Jews when there's so many Jews at the forefront of the solidarity campaign with Palestine. And there's groups like Jewish Voice for Peace. There's groups like If Not Now. Those are American. I know there's equivalents in the UK. So that's already upsetting here, is this trying to speak on behalf of all Jews on this issue. But moreover, and I want to get your reaction to this, but like what this says to me is just equating the idea of free Palestine as being something that's offensive. It sounds to me like a white person who's offended by seeing a Black Lives Matter sign or panicked by seeing a Black Lives Matter sign. And so I just wanted to it's a silly tweet and it almost looks like a parody and it got trashed and ratioed, but I wanted to get your reaction because I don't think that this sentiment I think it's a prevalent sentiment among people who support Israel. And I think it has a lot to do with, go ahead, I want to get your reaction to it.
Well, I think the interesting thing is this. You had consensus between what was defined as the right and the quote unquote left of the Zionist movement prior to the foundation of the state of Israel. So Jabotinsky representing the right, Ben-Gurion representing, and Chaim Weizmann representing what they call the left, and even as far back as Theodor Herzl, that the Palestinians were indigenous to the land. There is, of course, in the expulsion of the Palestinians by Noor Masalha, the quote from Chaim Weizmann, when he says, the British had found there were a few, and as far as I understand, he uses the Hebrew word for Negroes in Palestine, a few 100,000 of them, but they are of no import. Theodor Herzl said clearly, we will form a rampart of European civilization against Eastern barbarism. And he said, we must spirit the penniless population across the border and be rid of them. What does that sound like to you? You have, of course, Jabotinsky making clear that every indigenous people will resist alien settlers. And Ben-Gurion himself even writing in the around 1915, that the Palestinians were indigenous to the land. So when we're thinking about a situation where even the State Department in the US says that Israel practices institutional and societal discrimination, where the Palestinian legal group Adalah has identified more than 50 laws which explicitly enshrine inequality between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis, where you have something called the law of return, which allows a Jewish or a person who's not even Jewish but can prove that they have one Jewish grandparent can go and claim citizenship in Palestine and then be trained and armed by the Israeli state. but Palestinians that have lived there for generations and generations and generations have no form of national belonging, then clearly this imbalance and this core contradiction will continue to manifest in different ways. And to be honest, it's not massively surprising that people who are invested in maintaining that status quo would be dominated by a sense of fear when you consider just how much cognitive dissonance it would require to buttress this type of social arrangement within society. You know, it is simply not sustainable.
Yeah, and you know, when you look at Israel now, and the sort of, you were mentioning this, the liberal side of Zionism versus the right wing side of it, the right wing religious messianic side is in charge of the Israeli government now, and Israeli society is moving so far to the right. I think we saw that play out the last couple of weeks when you saw these Jewish supremacist lynch mobs, I don't know what else to call them, rampaging through Israeli cities, hunting for Palestinians to lynch and beat up. And so it's interesting to me to see that there's these liberal Israel supporters still working so hard in Western countries like the UK, like the US, to try and give cover to essentially what's becoming a fascistic state. But can you give us an idea from your vantage point what you see Israel as turning into? Because obviously Zionism has always been ethnically cleansing Palestinians. Obviously, it's always been seeking to replace them with Jews to maintain its Jewish demographic majority. But there's I think, a different element and a more dangerous element to what's happening now because of this eliminationist, it's the religious messianic mindset. But how do you see Israel as a society at this moment?
Well, I think we're seeing the convulsions of a dying idea. And as Thomas Paine said, time makes more converts than reason. And Palestinians are applying Eduardo Galeano's famous quote when he says it's worthwhile to die for things without which it is not worthwhile to live. And Palestinians are really taking action in a completely unprecedented way. If you think that 50% of the construction workers within the Green Line are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, 50% of them are below the poverty line, then you see that there's all types of contradictions which are rearing their head. Now, Israel has, from the early stages of what they call the Yeshuv, the settlement in Hebrew, of Zionists within Palestine, you saw several different strands of how to deal with this population. You saw the development of what is now known as Mustarabin, so groups, a unit within the Israeli police and IDF forces of people that are able to imitate Palestinians successfully enough to infiltrate their communities, in some cases even marrying Palestinians and disappearing while people who they've collected information on get arrested. This was something that developed in the early 1900s, and the first unit as part of the Palmach, which was Ben-Gurion's side of the Zionist movement, developed in 1942. You also see the other sides of it, which are outwardly, clearly fascistic, as we spoke about before with Jabotinsky and him emulating Mussolini. But what will happen inevitably as Palestinians decide to no longer just suffer through clenched teeth at this continuous Nakba, as them beginning to see the Palestinian Authority and those who have benefited from the peace process, which was a subterfuge for further Zionist settlement, to see those actors as ideologists of impotence, we are now seeing further fascism of the Israeli state come out. And those settlements that I talked about, those colonies, are essentially sleeper cells. And the fact is that as Palestinians make themselves more ungovernable, Israel will descend further and further into raw fascism. This is the convulsion of a dying idea. Now, how the rest of the world is able to, what's interesting to me is you have movements like Tommy Robinson and Katie Hopkins basically depicting what is peaceful immigration to this country as violent colonialism, and the liberal depiction of what's happening in Palestine, which is violent colonialism, as peaceful immigration. You are seeing these things bumping against themselves. The mask has fallen, as Mahmoud Darwish said. Israel is no longer able to export this idea of itself to gullible, useful idiots around the world, that it is somehow a bastion of liberalism and democracy, when it is in fact clearly only existing the way it does through military dictatorial imposition on the region within which it exists.
That was really well said. I want to turn for a moment because I know, we've been going for a while, and I want to ask a bit of a more like personal background question. So I think this is always interesting. Did you grow up understanding Palestine in this way, or was there a sort of radicalization process for you to understand Palestine? How did you get to the place you're at on this issue?
I would say that Iraq has had a supportive relationship with Palestine even prior to the foundation of the Israeli state. You know, you can't forget that in order to move Jewish people from Iraq to Palestine to take part in the Zionist project, you had Zionist emissaries placed within Iraq who were writing letters back to the heads of the Zionist movement, referencing Iraqi Jewish people as greater human material. It's literally in these words than the type of Jewish people that were coming out of Eastern Europe at that time. You had the finance minister of Iraq during the monarchy, a well-known Iraqi Jew. You had very prominent Iraqi Jewish families in Baghdad and Basra. So what happened was the Zionist movement started to court an Iraqi politician by the name of Tawfiq al-Suwaidi. Originally, as is outlined by Noor Salha in his book, The Expulsion of the Palestinians, there was the idea brought up to Tawfiq al-Suwaidi of a population swap, whereby Iraqi Jews would be transplanted into Palestine and Palestinians would be transplanted into Iraq. Obviously, there was no real support for that plan, so it never really flew. But what happened in the early 50s, by that time, Tawfiq al-Suwaidi was the prime minister. He passed something called the Denaturalization Act, which allowed Iraqi Jews to let go of their Iraqi citizenship in order to be flown to Palestine and become Israelis. Now, this was a small window of time in 1951. And in the first month, there's a great book by Abbas Shiblaq called The Lure of Zion, in which it goes month by month. At the very beginning of that policy, no Iraqi Jews took up Tawfiq al-Suwaidi on this offer. And what happened, as was attested to by the British Embassy in Iraq, the US Embassy in Iraq, and the Iraqi government, was Zionist organizations planted bombs at cafes used by Jews and synagogues even, in order to scare Jewish people away from Iraq. And eventually it was successful. There's a wonderful documentary called Ensa Baghdad, which looks at some of the Iraqi Jewish figures who were remembering their trip to Israel. When they first got off the plane, they were sprayed with DDT and left in camps. In fact, they had to protest in order to get adequate housing. So not only from the Arab nationalist side of the perspective within Iraq, you had a relationship with what was happening in Palestine. Obviously, Iraq were involved in 1948 and 1967 in differing ways. And really, the population were impeded in their ability to express their solidarity with the Palestinians by a compromised leadership. In fact, today in Palestine, in places like Jenin and Askar camp in Nablus, you have maqabr, you have graveyards to Iraqi fighters who died there in 1948 and were buried there. Obviously, the government previous to 2003 has a well-established relationship with the Palestinians. So there were all types of things that linked Iraqis to Palestinians, and that was something which inevitably I would have been brought up with some sense of. What really, I would say, pushed me towards being a political actor in the situation, though finally would have been Operation Cast Lead. And the way, in fact, it mobilized my community. I live in Ladbroke Grove, and many young men from my community, mainly Middle Eastern and North African, are full of excitement and enthusiasm, and specifically are frustrated by the lack of political subjectivity that they are allowed, specifically when it comes to the Palestinian issue, and the invisible walls and ceilings that exist within British policy towards Palestine. We took to the street outside the Israeli embassy, which actually is in the same borough as the area in which I live, the same municipality maybe in the US context. And many of those young men were arrested, were criminalized, ended up, some of them went from being in university to being in prison for several years. Some of their lives were changed irrevocably by the ways in which they were criminalized by that protest movement. As somebody that was involved in the protest movement, that saw that happen, that knew people it happened to, it would be impossible really for me to, after that point, turn away from the Palestinian cause. And obviously after that, then I was able to travel to Palestine and inevitably was detained several times by the Israelis. So that would, of course, increase the criticality with which I would view something like Zionism. But as you will probably know from the US context, for one to fashion a political education out of the collective imbecilization that we face in our education systems and through our curriculums is not an easy thing to do. And it takes patience, and it takes a willingness and a humility to read and to learn. So this is still a process that I'm partaking in.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the sort of I guess familial connection that you mentioned. Like, my family is Lebanese, so for me it was like I always understood this issue to some degree because of the fact that I grew up with Israel bombing the country that my parents had to leave. And, you know, on top of that, it always made me, and I think this is often left out of the conversation, but the way that hasn't just destroyed and cut up Palestine, but has also really shattered the fabric of the Middle East by removing some of the most ancient communities. I mean, the Jews of Baghdad, one of the oldest Jewish communities in the world, and there is no Jewish community in Baghdad anymore because of Zionism. And there's so many countries across the Middle East that are like that. Syria, there was even a Jewish community in Lebanon. And so it's like one country after another. And it really, this imposition of a sectarian state by the West onto this region, that was the first sectarian state imposed on the Middle East by the Europeans. And they've continued to attempt to, you know, impose sectarian states. They even tried to cut up Iraq into a Shia state and a Sunni state, and on and on and on. So it's like a part of understanding Palestine for me also was, from an anti-imperialist perspective, Israel's existence is very, very useful to the British and then the US and all of these Western imperialist countries, just keeping the region split. But I also, you know, I also think that there's something else that maybe you can relate to too, and that is, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, but the way that this issue connects so deeply to issues that people of color, that immigrants, the children of immigrants have to deal with in Western countries. And so, I mean, in the UK, I don't know if it's the same, but in the US, the Black Lives Matter movement has done a lot in really, just the anti-racist movement and the dominance of it and the growth of it has made it more difficult for a younger generation being educated in that language to see Palestine as anything other than or Israel as anything other than a racist entity. And so I'm curious if there's something similar happening with young people in the UK with the rise of this kind of social justice activism and the rise of the left in the younger generation, and if that helps make the connection easier for people.
Well, I spoke to Patrisse Cullors, one of the founders of Black Lives Matter in the United States, and she told me that when they came back from Palestine after their first trip, they had funders withdraw their funding. We know that the Black Lives Matter movement in this country had, in terms of the public sphere and the elite narrative, quite a large amount of at least aesthetic gestures of sympathy. However, when they stated their solidarity with the Palestinians and they followed in the vein of Emil Cabral, of James Baldwin, of Angela Davis, of Malcolm X, of many others who across history stated unequivocally of the Black Panthers their solidarity with the Palestinians. Of course, let's not forget that when George Jackson was killed in prison, they found a poem in his cell that was then reproduced and credited to him, when in fact the poem, Adu al-Shams, Enemy of the Sun, was written by Samih al-Qasim, the Palestinian poet. So clearly there is a commonality in terms of experience that people find within the Palestinian cause. But in terms of the British experience of Black Lives Matter, we know that following them stating their solidarity clearly with the Palestinians, the BBC then banned its employees from wearing insignia belonging to Black Lives Matter. British football teams and their owners banned taking the knee and stuff from matches. So clearly it was considered a point too far. Palestine and solidarity with Palestinians is something that cannot be assimilated by the political establishment here or in the United States. And it's also something that you can't subconscious racial awareness training your way out of. Yeah, you can't do these simple gestures that corporations love and use the kind of language that corporations use in order to subjugate and quell the hunger and the need for justice for Palestinian people. It's just not possible. So we will see that contradiction rub up against that inflexibility of our corporate and political classes within this country over the forthcoming months. And the reality is that the British government, in reaction to the Black Lives Matter movement, though they didn't make it clear, you have a movement where it was something like 4,000 to 5,000 protests in the United States. You had tens of protests here, at least. You had the bringing down of statues of slave traders. The British government's response to this call for accountability for security services was to pass a law which made security services completely unaccountable and impossible to convict them of anything. But in addition to that, was also to ban anti-capitalist texts within British schools. Now, were people to follow the idea of racism to its layer, they would be led to the existing economic system within which we live, because it was that economic system which was based on the hierarchical understanding of humanity and the biological determinism of racism, which meant that Black lives did not matter, and that some lives were even defined as Black in the first place. And so understanding the British establishment that this mobilization of people would eventually lead to questioning that economic system, which allowed a country which, in terms of landmass, in terms of natural resources, in terms of human resources, is significantly limited to become the world's #1 economic power and occupy 14 million miles of the globe, they knew that that would lead people to question capitalism. And so in order to see that off and a way of securitizing that movement, they had to take those actions to ban those texts, at the same time as later on saying that to combat the woke agenda, they need free speech champions in all of the academies. It's just another way to astroturf the dominance of right-wing narratives within society.
Right, the whole idea of like cancel culture is we're anti-cancel culture, except when it comes to talking about class, when it comes to talking about Palestine, when it comes to talking about race. Other than that, we're just anti-cancel culture for canceling right-wingers. That's essentially what it comes down to. And then the last thing I wanted to
of canceling,
go ahead.
Sorry, just to speak briefly to that point, that point, that form of canceling, you have had an established anti-fascist strategy of no platforming, which has operated across British society for at least the last 60 years, at least 60, 70 years. However, what they are trying to do is depict what is more similar to a bottom-up movement organized by students at most, campaigning to not allow speakers on campuses that are directly involved and encouraging forms of violence against people, to somehow forge some equivalence between that and the type of cancel culture that has played out in our schools, which I would say, and it's important to emphasize this, that the war on terror that's gone on as long as World War I and World War II put together, which has led to tens of millions of people being displaced and millions of people dying, has meant that there has been a death of civil liberties within Britain. Supposedly, Britain is a place where the Magna Carta is massively important. Well, you could simultaneously have a child in a British school learning about the importance of the Magna Carta while having habeas corpus not given to a relative of theirs who would be detained indefinitely without access to the evidence held against them and without being judged by a jury of their peers, simultaneous to that child being questioned by police without their parents' knowledge just for wearing a Free Palestine badge or for using the words eco-terrorist within class. And these are real examples. So it's funny how the cancel culture only ever affects well-fed, well-paid, middle-aged men that write for major newspapers who get cancelled upwards. It never seems to affect the vulnerable in society.
I like that. They get canceled upwards. That's a good way to put it. One of the last things I wanted to ask you about, because I know we're getting a bit limited on time, is you were very active around Grenfell, the apartment building that caught fire a few years back. And I think over 90 people died. And a large number of people living there were immigrants or children. I'm sorry, what you were specifying. Oh, I thought you were.
72.
But
72.
92 people died.
72, sorry, 72.
72, I'm sorry, 72 people died. I'm curious if you see what happened in Grenfell Tower as a kind of form of like British imperialism turned inward. I feel like that's a lot of what I see, at least in the US. I'm not trying to project the US onto everything. I'm such an American like that. But I mean, in the US, you do see this kind of, imperialism turning inward in the way that neoliberalism and these policies that the US enacts abroad and kind of hollows out other countries' economies are being applied internally, and as a result are leading to this kind of decay and rot inside of America. And I'm curious if you see the Grenfell Tower fire as a kind of similar aspect of what I just described, and in a way kind of connect that. I feel like that sort of connects to the struggle for liberation of not just Palestine, but the world from this awful, disgusting economic system we have. But I guess, would you agree with that? Do you see it in that light?
Yes, I would, and in the following way. So, firstly, the tower, which I live opposite, which a friend of mine and his entire family died in, which I witnessed the fire, this tower was named after a British general by the name of Francis Wallace Grenfell. Now, the material on the tower, which promoted the fire, as has been proven by the inquiry, was Arconic's PE Renabond, which contained 6 millimeters of polyethylene. Arconic as a company not only built the F-35 with BAE Systems and Lockheed Martin, but also their major shareholder is Elliott Management, which is a hedge fund that the founder and president of is Paul E. Singer, who I mentioned earlier. Now, Paul E. Singer, top Republican donor, but he also funds Birthright Israel, Friends of the IDF, the Israel Independence Fund. He also funds the NGO Monitor in Jerusalem, the European Foundation for Democracy, and Memory. All of these are directly intertwined and entrenched with the Israeli state. And we also mentioned earlier his organization designed to combat BDS by inserting Unit 8200, former Unit 8200 employees into big tech companies. So actually, they're deeply intertwined. And even from a social order perspective, we have to remember that it's a community that was deeply securitized, not only from the mobilization outside the Israeli embassy, but also from the situation in Syria. It meant that this community had within it the structures of surveillance that were in fact invisible only through their ubiquity. And so when you are the British state and you are attempting to deal with a potentially riotous situation in a community like this, you will call upon all of the existing mechanisms of security that are already there within the community. In terms of the way Grenfell relates to the rest of the world, it is true that of the 72 people that died, the majority of them were Muslim, were Middle Eastern, were North African, but also there was a level of conviviality within the building that really, if the rest of the country were able to see, they would understand that when you are today talking about over 1 million people in this country, by some estimates, leaseholders. So according to Thatcher's property owning democracy, these are people who should not be in the position they are in, having the same cladding on the outside of their building and being told that they have to pay to remove it. If the rest of this society were able to see themselves in this community, you would have a greater understanding of this necropolitical, bipartisan, neoliberal orthodoxy, which has governed our country for several decades now. And unfortunately, even since 2019, you have seen hospitals and schools built with the same flammable, combustible material. Less than a mile from Grenfell Tower, there is a special needs primary school, which currently has combustible insulation in it made by one of the same companies that put combustible insulation in Grenfell. Unfortunately, we have seen a non-reactive system. You cannot cleanse our political elite from this servility towards corporate interests. It is built into the system within which we live. It is the commonsensical way in which our society functions. The lawmakers are more beholden to their main constituency, which is their donors, than they are to people like us. And the core part of this is that there are deep truths about the ways all of us live in the ways that some of us die. And unfortunately, because of the identity of people in this community, the rest of this country did not see the mirror image of themselves.
Wow. Wow. I mean, it's what do you do? Like, what do you do in a system like that? Right. I mean, on Palestine, we kind of know what to do as a bottom up movement. It's BDS. But in a broader context, I mean, you said it's these people in power are there to serve these corporate interests. It's built in. And I know it's a really big question and probably hard to answer in just a couple of minutes, but what is the way forward in terms of being able to defeat a system that isn't going to change or isn't going to reform itself, has proven over the last several decades that it cannot reform itself?
Well, we tried with Jeremy Corbyn, but we underestimated the malignancy or the intransigence or how dynamic this system was. We underestimated the extent to which people were gullible and were had the propensity to be gaslighted into dancing to a tune that was never theirs in the first place. And so really, what I think we see is one of the key lessons from the first Intifada in Palestine, actually, is that organized civil disobedience and lack of cooperation can really push us into a better place. Were we to have had the clear cooperation of unions with the community here to say that they would tell their workers to refuse to install harmful materials into buildings, then we would dictate and enforce the parameters of logic for the people that govern this society. Unfortunately, those bonds were not made in the deep way that they should have been made. And those types of initiatives were not put forward. This system is not designed for justice. It's designed for careful management of social injustice. And so, unfortunately, we need to be keenly aware that we are not going to get the things that were promised. You know, Boris Johnson said himself in Parliament that he would implement all of the recommendations of the inquiry. And as tame as the recommendations of the first stage of the inquiry were, they were not implemented by this government. Clearly, we see it's a carefully managed system of social injustice rather than something that is likely to give way to the type of pressures that we were applying.
Well, on that note, Loki, where can our viewers follow your work?
They can see stuff on Twitter, on Instagram, obviously on YouTube as well. And yeah, thank you very much for having me. And I hope we can speak again soon.
Yes, absolutely. We'd love to have you on Breakthrough News again. This was such a pleasure. And I say that as somebody who 10 years ago, I remember watching your music videos and I was a really big fan.
Oh, wow.
So it's been really cool to actually, this is the first time I've been able to interview you. So this has been really cool experience for me. And also I've learned a lot. So thank you so much for joining us. Hip hop artist and campaigner, the British Iraqi Lowkey. Thank you so much for coming on Dispatches on Breakthrough News.
Thank you. Take care.